Hey there, my name is Jared, and welcome to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. In this episode, we'll take a look at Judaism. Happy Rosh Hashanah for those that are Jewish listening or watching. Happy New Year. Welcome to the show, and l'chaim to all the Jewish watchers and listeners. In this episode, we are going to stay in the Middle East and the Abrahamic religions and get into Judaism. In the first section, we'll take a look at some history, one of my favorite subjects. In the second section, we'll get a brief overview of what Jews believe. And then the last section, we'll take a look at some of their customs and culture. Before we go to break, here's some food for thought. According to the Hebrew calendar, what year is it? Is it A, 2020, B, 1920, or C, 5781? The answer when we come back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Happy Rosh Hashanah or Happy New Year. And the answer to what year is it according to the Hebrew calendar? Is it A, 2020, B, 2019, or C, 5781? The answer is C, 5781. And this leads us right into one of my favorite subjects, history. I'd like to do a whole other episode on calendars at a later date. I know, I can dad joke with the best of them, by the way. But because I'm saving it up, I won't get too in-depth about it here. But all bad jokes aside, according to the Hebrew calendar, it's the latter part of the 5th millennium. Did we miss something here? Well, this gets into the age-old debate about the little letters after the year, like AD or BC or CE or BCE. With the Hebrew calendar, it's actually AM, and it's because of what these abbreviations mean. AD stands for Anno Domini and is Latin for in the year of the Lord, or in the year of our Lord, referring to the birth of Jesus Christ. CE is the abbreviation for Common Era. BC stands for Before Christ, and AM stands for Anno Mundi, meaning year after creation. Right or wrong, it means that according to the Hebrew calendar, the earth is 5,781 years old. But what does the Hebrew calendar have to do with Judaism. The history of Judaism begins long before Abraham. Some scholars believe there is ample evidence that the Hebrew peoples mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions as far back as the 13th century BC are in fact the Hebrews. Hebrews were a semi-nomadic peoples, meaning that they moved to a place, settled, and then moved again. So Hebrew is really just a way of saying a type of people, much like Gypsy. In the previous episode about Islam, we went over the story of Abraham and how a man named Abram received a promise from God that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. Abraham and his family were Hebrews. They eventually rose up to leave the land of Ur, of the Chaldees, where Abram grew up, and to travel to the land of Canaan, but they didn't make it. After Abram's dad died, Abram and the rest of his family continued on to Canaan, and Abram ended up having 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abram's name was then changed from Abram to Abraham. Isaac comes from his legitimate wife Sarah, and Ishmael comes from Sarah's handmaiden, Hagar. Isaac's son, Jacob, had his name also changed to Israel. Israel, the man, had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Benjamin, and Joseph. These became the 12 tribes of Israel, the place. Israel, the place, operated as a confederation, where each province had equal rights. Eventually, the people got tired of the bickering and demanded a king from the prophet Samuel. Samuel anointed a king, King Saul, over Israel in around the 11th century BC. After King Saul came King David, then David's son, King Solomon. From King Solomon came an heir to the throne, and his son named Rehoboam. But the northern tribes of the United Kingdom of Israel refused to accept Rehoboam as king, and it divided the kingdom of Israel into 2. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin stayed loyal to Rehoboam, while the other 10 tribes revolted. What was left was 2 kingdoms, called Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. The term Judaism derives from a Latinized form of the ancient Greek word meaning to side or imitate the Judeans. Thus, Jew came from Judaism or Judah. So, Judaism came from Judah, Jews came from Judah. Judah was the leader of a tribe of Israel. He was the son of a man named Israel. Israel was not just a name picked out of a hat. It was a man who had 12 sons. This man was originally named Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and Isaac was the son of Abraham. So now we see that the word Judaism means many things. It means people, the Jews. Originally it was the Israelites, and it was the Israelite religion. and eventually became known as Judaism. So Judaism has come to mean a region as well as a religion. In the next section, we'll go over the Jewish beliefs. Before we go to break, I'd like to ask, what does it take to be a Jew? Can you just be born a Jew, or do you have to go through some kind of ritual? We'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. The question before the break was, can someone be born into the Jewish religion, or can they become a Jew? The answer to this question is actually both. Because Jews are descendants of Israelites, Jews are considered a people or ethnicity, and not just a religion. But that ethnicity comes from a religion following God, and because religion is the backbone of the ethnicity, then someone who is not born Jewish can in fact convert to Judaism. Let's look at the religious beliefs of Judaism. Unlike other ancient Near Eastern gods, the Hebrew God is portrayed as unitary and solitary. Consequently, the Hebrew God's principal relationships are not with other gods, but with the world, and more specifically, with the people he created. Judaism, thus, begins with ethical monotheism, the belief that God is one and is concerned with the actions of mankind. God promised Abraham to make of his offspring a great nation. Many generations later, he commanded the nation of Israel to love and worship only one God. That is, the Jewish nation is to reciprocate God's concern for the world. He also commanded the Jewish people to love one another. That is, Jews are to imitate God's love for people. These commandments are but two of a large amount of commandments and laws that constitute this covenant, which is the substance of Judaism. Scholars throughout Jewish history have proposed numerous formulations of Judaism's core tenets or core beliefs, all of which have met with criticism. The most popular formation is the 13 Principles of Faith, developed in the 12th century. According to the author of these tenets, any Jew who rejects even one of these principles would be considered an apostate or a heretic. Without explaining every single one, let's just look at what those are. 13 Principles of Faith. Number 1, the Creator is the guide of everything that has been created. He alone was made, does make, and will make all things. This is the belief that a supreme being created the world. Number 2, the Creator or God is one, and that there is no unity in any manner like His, and that He alone is God, who was and is and will be. Number 3, God has no body, and he is free from all the properties of matter, and there can be no physical comparison to him whatsoever. This belief is similar to the younger religion of Islam, and also a crossroads between Judaism and Christianity. Number 4, God is the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. Number 5, God alone is right to pray, and that is not right to pray to any being besides him. This is where Judaism and Catholicism part ways, as Catholics pray to saints and sometimes angels. Number 6, belief that all the words of the prophets are true. Number 7, belief that the prophecies of Moses were true, and that he was the chief of the prophets, both of those who preceded him and those who followed him. Number 8, belief that the entire Torah that is now in our possession is the same that was given to Moses. Moses was the author of the Torah. The Torah, or books of law, are the first 5 books of the Bible. Number 9, belief that the Torah will not be exchanged and that there will never be any other Torah from God. This is the belief that the law was given and it will never change. Number 10, belief that God knows all the deeds of human beings and all their thoughts, as it is written, who fashioned the hearts of them all, who comprehends all their actions. That comes from Psalms 33:15. Number 11, belief that God rewards those who keep his commandments and punishes those that transgress against them. Number 12, belief in the coming of the Messiah, a Savior and Liberator, who will be the future Redeemer of the Jewish people. Number 13, belief that there will be a revival of the dead at the time chosen by God, and God shall be exalted forever and ever. These are the basic concepts or tenets of belief. How they play out and what those ideas look like in the real world gets into how they live as Jewish people. These laws affect everyday life in Judaism. Things like what kind of clothing they can wear, what they can eat, how they pray, and when they fast. There are also holidays or holy days, as given by God, summed up in Leviticus 23. Though these holy days are given to the Israelites, they are considered feasts of the Lord and practiced by anyone that believes in God, the God of the Bible, around the world. I will be doing a whole other episode on the Feast of the Lord soon, as well as a documentary. When we get back, we'll get into some of the customs and cultures of Judaism, how they live out these beliefs. Before the break, I'd like to ask, what is Hanukkah the celebration of? Think about it, and we'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Jared Show WisdomPodcast. Before the break, the question of Hanukkah was posed. What is Hanukkah the celebration of? Many people around the world, whether they claim to be Christian or not, celebrate Christmas during the winter solstice at the end of the Gregorian calendar year, usually in December. But those that are Jewish do something a bit different. Because of this difference, Hanukkah is generally the most famous custom associated with Jewish beliefs. But what is it? Hanukkah, also known as the Festival of Lights, is an 8-day Jewish holiday that starts on the 25th day of Kislev. The festival is observed in Jewish homes by the kindling of lights on each of the festival's 8 nights. 1 on the first night, 2 on the second night, and so on. The holiday was called Hanukkah, meaning dedication, because it marks the rededication of the temple after its desecration by Antiochus IV. Spiritually, Hanukkah commemorates the miracle of the oil. According to the Talmud, at the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem following the victory of the Maccabees, there was only enough consecrated oil to fuel the eternal flame in the temple for 1 day. Miraculously, the oil burned for 8 days, which was the length of time it took to press, prepare, and consecrate new oil. Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Bible and was never considered a major holiday in Judaism, but it has become much more visible and widely celebrated in modern times, mainly because it falls around the same time as Christmas and has national Jewish overtones that have been emphasized since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 or 47. Other than Hanukkah, Jews observe many more customs that shape much more than just 8 days out of the year. Let's find out about some of them now. Prayers. Traditionally, Jews recite prayers 3 times daily, morning, noon, and night, with a 4th prayer added on Saturday and holidays. These prayers come from a prayer book and are recited rather than thought up on the spot. In addition to prayer services, observant traditional Jews recite prayers and benedictions throughout the day when performing various acts. Prayers are recited upon waking up in the morning, before eating or drinking different foods, after eating a meal, and so on. Perhaps a custom that is equally famous within Jewish culture is the kippah, a slightly rounded, brimless skull cap worn by many Jews while praying, eating, reciting blessings, or studying Jewish religious texts, and at all times by some Jewish men. In Orthodox communities, only men wear the kippah. In non-Orthodox communities, some women wear it as well. Kippahs range in size from a small round beanie that covers only the back of the head to a large, snug cap that covers the whole crown. While it is debated whether a man has to cover his head at all times, what is not debated is that a man must cover his head during prayer. Covering one's head, such as by wearing a kippah, is described as honoring God. In addition to the kippah, there are a few more articles of clothing. Bear with me with these names, by the way. The tzitzit are special knotted tassels found on the 4 corners of the tallit or prayer shawl. It is worn during the prayer service by men and some women. A small version of this is worn under the clothing throughout the day. There is also the tefillin. This is 2 square leather boxes containing biblical verses attached to the forehead and wound around the left arm by leather straps. They are worn during weekday morning prayer by observant Jewish men and Jewish women. And lastly, there is a kittel. A white, knee-length garment is worn by prayer leaders and some observant traditional Jews on the high holy days. Jewish males are buried in a tallit and sometimes also a kittel, which are part of the burial garments. Another more famous custom of Judaism is the dietary laws or restrictions. Perhaps you've seen the kosher selection at the local grocery store. Kosher is food that is prepared according to the Jewish dietary laws. This is what is deemed as kosher, or clean is really the best way to say it. Many of the laws apply to animal-based foods. For example, in order to be considered kosher, mammals must have split hooves and chew their cud. The pig is arguably the most well-known example of a non-kosher animal. Although it has split hooves, it does not chew its cud. For seafood to be kosher, the animal must have fins and scales. Certain types of seafood, such as shellfish, crustaceans, and eels, are therefore considered non-kosher. Concerning birds, a list of non-kosher species is given in the Torah. The exact translation of many of the species have not survived, and some non-kosher birds' identities are no longer certain. However, traditions exist about the law-abiding status of a few birds. For example, both chickens and turkeys are permitted in most communities. Other types of animals, such as amphibians, reptiles, and most insects, are prohibited altogether. In addition to the requirement that the species be considered kosher, meat and poultry, but not fish, must come from a healthy animal slaughtered in a specific way. Without the proper slaughtering practices, even an otherwise kosher animal would be rendered unclean. The slaughtering process is intended to be quick and relatively painless to the animal. Forbidden parts of animals include the blood, some fats, and the area in and around the sciatic nerve. Jewish law also forbids the consumption of meat and dairy products together. The waiting period between eating meat and eating dairy varies by the order in which they are consumed and by community, and can extend for up to 6 hours. Based on the biblical injunction against cooking a kid in its mother's milk, this rule is mostly derived from the oral Torah, the Talmud, and rabbinic law. Chicken and other kosher birds are considered the same as meat under the law, but the prohibition is rabbinic, not biblical. The use of dishes, serving utensils, and ovens may make food unclean that would otherwise be kosher. Utensils that have been used to prepare non-kosher food, or dishes that have held meat and are now used for dairy products, render the food unclean under certain conditions. Furthermore, all Orthodox and some conservative authorities forbid the consumption of processed grape products made by non-Jews due to ancient pagan practices of using wine in rituals. Some conservative authorities permit wine and grape juice made without rabbinic supervision. Having worked in a lot of kitchens as a cook, dishwasher, and food prepper, most of this just sounds like good, healthy food practices. And also, I will say that isn't it interesting, especially in Western culture, that food and meat, basically Western culture, is very much against every single thing I just said. Bacon is put on everything. Dairy products and meat are regularly put together. and we have an epidemic of obesity. I do think those two things are interesting. Whether they connect to each other, a different thing altogether. One more somewhat famous Jewish custom is that of the mitzvah, whether it be bar or bat. So perhaps you've heard of a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, this passage from childhood to adulthood takes place when a female Jew is 12 and a male Jew is 13 years old, among Orthodox and some conservative congregations. In the Reform movement, both girls and boys have their bar bat mitzvah at age 13. This is often commemorated by having the new adults, male only in the Orthodox tradition, lead the congregation in prayer and publicly read a portion of the Torah. It is a celebration, but also a turning point where the child becomes responsible for their own actions in the sight of God, and a choice is put forth to choose God or choose the world. In this episode about Judaism, we have learned some history, gotten into the core beliefs, and gotten a good idea of what living those beliefs out in Jewish culture is like. In the next episode, we'll move to the last of the Abrahamic religions, last major religion of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please like and subscribe to the podcast on either YouTube or wherever you like to listen or watch. Thank you for watching or listening. And as always, and in always, may God bless you. Thanks.